All right, this is the fifth video in a 5-part mini-series on trauma and addiction. My name is Matthew, this is Conscious Recovery, and the topic of today's video is precisely the reason I called all of this Conscious Recovery. So the fifth way that trauma can affect the individual from their childhood right up through to their adulthood is by causing a loss of executive function. Now, executive function has to do with brain activity, and executive function is all of the highest level thinking that our brain is capable of. Now, to better describe this, I'm going to go through brief overviews of the different brain levels. Quick caveat on that, please don't take this to be a master class in neuroanatomy. I am not a neuroscientist. I have a basic understanding of these things, and that's what I'm going to share with you now. And furthermore, I actually don't think it's all that useful for anybody in recovery to know the brain areas, know all the names, know all the parts, unless, of course, that knowledge is tied with a strategy to help strengthen their recovery. So that's what we're doing today. We're learning how trauma and addiction affects these brain areas, how they go wrong, okay, and then we can compensate for those deficits by coming up with strategies to help us. So your brain can be thought of as being roughly divided into 3 levels. All right, so there's the brain stem, there's the midbrain, and then there's the neocortex, the higher level thinking part of the brain. The brain stem, also sometimes called the reptilian brain, is responsible for basic biological functions. Breathing, heart rate, hunger, thirst, sleep, all those things happen automatically in the brain stem, and you don't have to put any conscious thought into that at all. You never have to decide to go to sleep. You never have to choose to be hungry. It just happens. And it's called the reptilian brain because it's very similar in structure and function in us as it is in reptiles. So that part of the brain has been around a long time, and it's been doing the same job for a long time. Next level up is the midbrain, and this is where other systems that are more associated with mammals operate, like the limbic system. If you remember my second video on addiction and trauma, we talk about a dysregulated limbic system, how trauma leaves you with wild and frantic emotions in the limbic system. But the limbic system isn't just responsible for emotions, it's also our motivational centers of our brain, the parts that so quote unquote get hijacked by addiction. So the limbic system, I call it the desire and acquire circuitry. This is the part of the brain that sees something, uses your memory to know what that something is, and then communicates with your nucleus accumbens so that you are motivated to go and get it. So desire and acquire, want, get. Want, get. We get excited for something and we go after it, right? That's the limbic system. The next level up is where the executive function lives. You can call it the neocortex or you can call it the prefrontal cortex. It doesn't really matter. What matters is what executive function does for us. Executive function is everything intellectual about being a human being. This is where we can make a plan. We can execute self-control and discipline in order to achieve that plan. Executive function is responsible for problem solving, right? It's responsible for largely impulse control, making sure we don't just do everything that pops into our head. We slow down and we think about things, right? So everything good that you've ever decided to do that worked out well came from your executive functions. And if you grew up with a background of trauma, like I did, your executive functions didn't grow up the way they should. They didn't develop the way they should. And there's an important reason for this. When you are under stress, your executive functions, your prefrontal cortex, kind of shut down. They don't work at full capacity. And here's a perfect example that everybody always goes, aha, whenever I share it. Have you ever had an argument, and in the midst of this heated argument, you can't think of the right thing to say to win the argument? Okay, but then later, the argument ends, you go your separate ways, and then a couple hours later, you think of the perfect thing that you should have said that would have won you the argument if only you'd thought of it in the moment. Well, you didn't think of it in the moment because you were angry and your prefrontal cortex, your executive functions, were shut down. It's only after your body calms down and your mind calms down that your executive functions come back online, allowing you to think of the perfect rebuttal that would have won you the argument. Right? That's how executive functions work. They don't work under stress. So if you're a child growing up in a dangerous and unsafe environment, if you're constantly under stress from abuse, neglect, trauma, whatever, you're not developing your executive functions the way you could be because they're offline a good deal of the time. All right. So we need to find ways to calm ourselves, to calm our bodies, to make sure that we are not still getting triggered into trauma responses, because the more we can use our executive functions, the better we can plan for our recovery. That's the whole reason I called this thing conscious recovery, because we need to use our slow, deliberate, conscious executive function thought in order to plan our way out of all of this automatic stuff that keeps getting us stuck in our addiction. So it's very, very important that we find ways to calm the body and to use different ways of making decisions. All right. So that's what I want to discuss in the next video. And we're going to talk about a lot more tools that'll help you kind of bypass this problem with your executive function. If your brain is diminished from either trauma and or addiction, probably both, as it was in my case, I couldn't very well use an unhealthy brain to come up with healthy solutions. All right. It's like the very thing I'm trying to use to get myself better is broken. So what do you do with that? You have to find different ways to bypass those deficits. So next video, we're going to be talking about a very foolproof way to write everything down on paper. And when you write it down, you are using nothing but your executive function, and it takes all of the guesswork out of everything else that goes into your choices. So that's up next, cost-benefit analysis. Tune in next time.